Welcome everyone. This is episode 17 of the Transmaxxing podcast. And today's guest is Malcolm Collins.
Them all, and then I went to be like, okay, what are the people who, because I know it's considered just for people who don't know in context, I was told to look up the topic, the Autogynephilia studies
Yes.
before this call. So I went through a bunch of stuff on that I went through like popularly because I knew that it was considered like a very offensive idea. It was in some parts of the trans community. So then I went up and looked to see what like the ultra normies were saying about it. So I went to ContraPoint's video on it. And I feel like I'd love to hear you guys.
My conclusion regarding all this is that obviously there are people who have those sexual preferences for being like a woman and it turns them on. And like even trans activists like ContraPoints clearly state that this is like your experience. So this isn't really too controversial. I think the controversial aspects are like how to interpret that. So you can interpret that people are transitioning because of that, or you can say that this is just some byproduct and this is like a natural result of people being like trans or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it makes sense. There were a few things I found really interesting in the data when I was going through it. So one, I would give you sort of like our thesis on, the way that we sort of see trans and gender and stuff like that is that while they're likely, like obviously, like I think it's an uncontroversial thing to say that there is some population, how large the population is with and without the trans community, that experiences sexual arousal, these ideas, at ideas like, and other sorts of transformation ideas. So, bimbofication's really common in pornography, forced gender transition, furries. I think that there's a pretty big overlap between like animal transformation and parts of the trans community, which means that there might be, a disproportionate amount of transition related, like bodies are transitioning, something arousing is going on there. But I also think separate from that, in something that in the popular media and that to some extent has been forgotten when transness became an identity rather than just a sexuality, was that crossdressers were like this really big community, and the majority of them didn't seem to be into it for sexual reasons from what I can see. Like when I look at old videos of what was going on in cross-dressing communities in like the 80s and stuff like that, and there was the famous statistic that something like the majority of men who regularly cross-dress at least identified as cis straight men. And when I watch videos of cross-dressing communities from like the 80s and stuff like that. And I see a lot of these men who are obviously, or at least to me, like otherwise cis straight men who are doing this. What it indicates to me, and that is that there's something that I call a gender display impulse, which I think is entirely different from the sexuality system of a human person. And, people talk about like, oh, it's souls in the wrong body or whatever, like the more hippie ways of explaining this, but I think they're probably not accurate. I think it's a combination of something likely with the gender display impulse system, then a separate system, which is just the sexuality system. And then there's likely a separate system, which is the self-identity system. Now, the self-identity system, I suspect in most people is something that you have full control over, but that society sort of impress ideas on you. And so that, you can begin to feel like, well, this is what my self-identity should be if I'm having these sexual feelings and these gender display feelings. But the gender display system is the interesting one because it's the least studied of all the systems. And it's one that's not covered in the autogynephilia research. But it's the system that I think it sort of evolved in humans. Women have wider hips than men. And as a result of having wider hips than men, they naturally sway a little bit when they walk, when contrasted with men. Well, males, they typically see anything that looks gender dimorphic as attractive, right? Larger breasts or something like that would be more attractive because it's more gender dimorphic. This isn't true of all men. This is just true of, but generally, an hourglass shape. Like, what is that? That's the gender dimorphic trait, right? Because baby birthing hips, right? Like that's what it's looking at because the female pelvic bone is very different than the male pelvic bone. So the difference in pelvic bones causes women to naturally sway a bit when they walk, and men would have picked up on this from an evolutionary context, like the men that differentially wanted to breed with other members of Homo sapien who swayed a bit when they walked would have more successfully targeted women, and thus would have had more surviving offspring. But then women, to exaggerate that feature, there could have been a gender display impulse that essentially told them, when you walk, if you like exaggerate the amount to which your hips are swaying a little bit, you will look even more like a woman, even more like you have this different bone structure. And that then those women would have had more surviving offspring. So you're getting a different system here that is rewarding behavior, ways of acting, ways of moving, ways of even talking, which are gender dimorphic. And by that, what I mean is they're different between men and women because of another example would be vocal structure, right? Well, because women are smaller, and they naturally would have slightly different voices than men to start. And you can see this within a lot of different cultures. Then you get gender dimorphic patterns of speech where even sort of the language structure leans in to the higher pitch and the more springy aspect. Mandarin, Chinese ways of talking as a woman looks so gender dimorphic, like much more gender dimorphic than you have in the US. Like the amount to which you can display gender within some cultures is much higher than the amount that you can display gender within other cultures. And I suspect that might have to do with how gender equal the cultures are, but I don't really know. We have a few hypotheses on what that is.
Here we come into something interesting. So for example, we see this thing, autogynephilia, even in people born female or something similar to it. And this might be because of this evolutionary pressure towards displaying femininity, because females who did not get turned on or whatever by like being feminine didn't get as much reproductive success, maybe didn't attract as high quality males. So from that standpoint it makes sense for females to have that. And this argument is actually fairly convenient for trans activists, because then they can say that we are just true trans if we have the same feelings, which might not really be true, or depends on how we define true trans or whatever. But it is in any case convenient.
Yeah. Is there a masculine version of this impulse?
Or people who clearly display autoandrophilia, because there was a male who read the Transmaxxing manifesto, and then when it was the point about sexual excitement from having a feminine body, he then said that I get that from having a masculine body. And sure, he might be like making that up to be like a tough guy, but it didn't come off as like he probably felt that genuinely, to be honest. Like otherwise I don't think he would have said that.
Yeah. Well, okay, so what I find more interesting and what I find really sad about the mainstream conversations around this is, because autogynephilia as a concept was picked up by the gender critical movement, that it became seen as hostile to sort of the monoculture in our society, and it became targeted as like a not valid reason to transition, not a valid reason to talk about. And because of that, we may have a less good understanding of what's actually going on. If my system is correct, if there are three core systems at play here, a self-identity system, a gender display impulse system, and an arousal impulse system, then it would mean that you have sort of three categories of people who could be transitioning for totally different reasons, which is really interesting to me. And it's especially interesting to me because I'd almost argue that like arousal would be the weirdest reason to transition, or likely the least fruitful reason to transition, because transitioning changes an individual's arousal pattern so much. At least that's my understanding for when I hear interviews of people who transition. Like the paraphilias, when I use the word paraphilias, I guess like the general translation of that is like fetish, or like weird things that turn a person on, often stop turning a person on after they transition. Am I accurate in that assessment or wrong?
You are to a large extent correct that it will change your sexuality. So when you start HRT, you might find out, oh, I don't enjoy it anymore, but it doesn't happen to everyone. So there's maybe another issue with the mainstream trans community is that the mainstream trans community thinks that like transition is something reversible, but you start transitioning and then you never stop. But if you're more flexible, you can just stop HRT right away if you don't like how it makes you feel or it changes your sexuality, and then you don't really have that problem anymore.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Something I really respect about this community and I like about this community, and I think it represents in a large way sort of where the larger trans community is going. And Simone was talking about this on a recent podcast, is we were talking about like why have fashions stopped changing? You know, like there's a meme basically post 1995 to present. Like not much has really changed in the way people dress. Or if you compare like the 80s to the 90s or the 70s to the 80s, there were pretty big changes. And what she ended up arguing is actually what changed is technology. The core changes in fashions during those previous periods were supply line and technology induced. And that she sort of suspects in the future, when it becomes much easier to transition genders and transition back from genders, that it will become less of a core identity modifier, but more like a fashion thing where a lot of people will transition at different parts of their lives. I wonder what you think of that, or do you think that that's just not likely going to happen? I mean, the core thing about transition now that makes it so, I'd say, difficult is it's very hard to sort of change course once you get to a certain point.
Yeah, here is maybe the crux of it is that if you had like surgeries, you have like no going back from them for the most part. You can maybe reverse FFS, but a lot of surgeries are irreversible. So then you really have to commit to it, because actually you might be screwed either way, because like even if you want to transition, if the surgery didn't go well, you're screwed anyway, even if you want to be like a woman. If you just take HRT, there are some difficulties or can be with detransitioning, but I think they are overblown, especially for MTF. Maybe for FTM,
Yeah.
there can be like voice issues maybe, and other things that are like harder to reverse.
Yeah, here's a question I have. Cross dressers, do they still exist anymore? By cross dressing, what I mean is there used to be, you know, if you look at the 80s, there was the trans community, which was fairly small, and then there was the cross dressing community that had no interest in transitioning, and most of them identified as cis men. But I haven't heard from them or about them in a long time. Did they become a much smaller community? Did most of them start transitioning when it became acceptable? Or do they still exist and we just don't talk about them much
I
anymore?
mean, they obviously exist, they are like a cross-dressing subreddit, but I think there are two factors that sort of worked against cross-dressing. For people who just want to present feminine, but don't want to like transition, you can just do that digitally now, so you can have like a female avatar and everything. And this makes it less
Mm,
appealing for people to pursue cross-dressing IRL. And also transitioning physically is more accessible as well, so you kinda got crushed from both direction. So of course there are people who do cross-dressing, but then there's also this issue with pausing as well. Because when you're not in an HRT, pausing after a certain age is basically impossible or very hard. So people start cross-dress at like 16, 17, it can work maybe up to like 20, 25, something like that, 24. But
yeah,
like
that makes sense. Yeah, because when I look at the cross-dressers now, they're typically really old people. Like I don't mean like really old, but what I mean is clearly they grew up in a different era. Like I haven't seen young people doing this.
there are probably some doing it. It just isn't that popular anymore. Like people don't
Yeah.
really care about for much about it.
Yeah.
It
It's very easy to just like tie into like the whole trans identity or in some way,
Yeah.
whether it's like you're gender fluid or you say that you're just a woman who doesn't take HRT. There's so many ways for them to just like say that they are trans, even if they're not taking hormones and stuff.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One of the things that we found when we were writing our sexuality book, which I don't know if I've talked about on any of the channels here yet, which we found very interesting, is that so like with gay identity or something like that, when you're talking about the Kinsey scale, it's fairly easily to covertly explore different types of sexual preferences. However, with gender displays, if you had like a lower volume but opposite direction version of that to a person's assigned sex at birth, it wouldn't likely come up or be easy to measure. So what we looked at is we tried to look at every community where a person could recreationally identify with a different gender. So we looked at the furry community where that can be done pretty easily, covertly, and we looked at the people who prefer to play opposite gender avatars in video games. And within both the communities, the number was around 20%. So our sort of takeaway from that is that the number of people within the population who at a level not enough to go through with often the social costs of transitioning, because, you know, in a lot of communities, those social costs are pretty high, but the number of people who are just sort of born lightly preferencing another gender is probably around 1 in 5, which I think is pretty interesting.
The thing with like avatars in like gaming is that what some people might say is that they are playing with the female character because they find them attractive. They have like a nice looking female character in some game, and they do that not because they like identify as that character, it's because they just find it like attractive and appealing. And I'm not sure how much of that is really true.
No, I hear that a lot as well. And that might indicate a portion of the people who are doing it as well. So it might be a lot less. But, oh, wait, hold on. That wouldn't explain furries. So why does, if you get a similar number in furries, don't have, like, this is one of these areas where I don't have a lot of, like, pre-baked thoughts. Continue.
I mean,
I think the term is autozoophilia, I think. Like, there's a lot of paraphilias that, like autosexuality, like there's autopedophilia, where people are attracted to, like, being, like, a child, or, like, the idea of, like, presenting themselves as a child. So there's, like, different, like, subsets of that, not just autogynephilia.
Yes.
Regarding like a video game character is that there's maybe a difference between like playing a game where you see your character all the time and like more a first person game, or like a VR game where you more are that character. I'm not sure if you can, like, if you then don't see any difference, maybe that like explanation is bullshit, that you want to like see a nice looking character. It might be like just that you want to be that and you don't want to like admit it.
Yeah, well, and this is a really interesting thing that I guess I only just started thinking about now. But sexuality, the systems tied to sexuality and the systems tied to pair bonding in men and women work really, really differently, to the extent where something I often hear from women is that when they become really attracted to a person, the way that feels in them is they want to like become like that person or like part of that person, which could be expressed in some men in regards to how they're viewing these characters. I don't know. It was just an idea that crossed my mind because it sounded sort of similar to something I've heard from women when you were saying that. But I don't know. I mean, I guess this group here would have more experience. I mean, anyone on hormones is going to have experienced likely aspects of both male and female sexuality, which would give them a wider understanding of how the two systems differ.
From what I have heard, a lot of people talk about when they go on hormones that they become like less visual and like more into like romance and things like that. So their sexuality changes and become more feminine.
Yeah, that was really interesting. I was seeing this recently where they did a chart, looking at men and women in private conversations and how much of the time are they talking about information about the world, like facts, or how much are they talking about their feelings about things that are happening. And it showed that in male conversations, people almost never talk about their feelings, which I think is pretty interesting. And it's definitely something I've experienced. It's very rare for me. It would even be like really odd for me to talk to another man about how I was feeling. It would feel, I think, very odd. And I wonder if that's a gender display thing, or if that's just a sociological, like, it must be a gender display thing if it's being altered by these hormones. I don't know. I'm open to thoughts.
Yeah, there are different factors here. For one, there is greater male competition, so males have to have their guard up and appear strong. So for example, alpha males, with chimpanzees, they have to like appear strong, and if they display weakness, they get this boost because they don't want to have a weak leader. So there is this like pressure for males to be strong and compete. Then there is also, of course, the hormones, because it makes sense for males to not display feelings if it is like detrimental, so therefore the testosterone will mute your feelings or attenuate more accurately your feelings, so you will feel like expressing them less. So for example, I pretty much never cry, and I think it's probably due to my male hormones. But maybe if I burn female hormones, I will cry like every week or something, I don't know.
Well, no, so this is really interesting. So my wife naturally has a male hormonal profile. So she has to take as much feminizing hormones as an average trans person every time she's trying to get pregnant again. And so she'll do this when she's talking with trans people, like, what hormones are you on right now? So she can judge where they are versus her. And so I get to see regularly in terms of my interaction with her how much her personality changes when she's on her hormone therapy to carry our kids. And specifically with crying, that's an area where I see a really big difference. She basically almost never cries in our normal life, and yet she will cry pretty frequently when she's on lots of hormones. And what's interesting is just sort of my external experience as somebody living with her. And I don't know if this is like, it's probably not a great thing to say or great for the future of our species, but I find her pretty unpleasant when she's on all of the hormones. Like, it's much harder for me to get along with her. And that makes me wonder if, when I'm giving relationship advice to like normal heterosexual people, if the relationship advice is actually utilizable, because our relationship would be so different with her having this very masculine hormonal profile, except during short periods where I find her pretty intolerable.
Yeah, this is super interesting. So it really shows how big of an impact female hormones have on behavior and everything.
Yeah, well, and something else you mentioned is you're like, well, as men, it's probably also that they have this competition dynamic. But I think when I think about it, I think a lot of men today aren't really thinking about the competitive aspect when they're acting that way. So I imagine that the competitive aspect might have added the evolutionary pressure to incentivize this difference in conversation types and this difference in how people are interacting. But I think that it's likely using a system within our brain to do that. And the thing that I really like to do when I'm trying to understand how humans think or how humans are different from each other is like meditate and capture in my mind that system so that I can begin to try to understand that system and how it works. Because biology does this thing where it will often reuse one system in like a totally different area. So an example of this is we argue that the system for gender differentiation, like, this is a female or male I want to sleep with, is the exact same system that's used for dominance displays and submission displays, and for rewarding those, and for eliciting those. And so that's why it's so common that these two systems can be sort of intermasturbated with similar sets of things, because it's literally just using the same reward mechanisms and reward pathways. It just has a new profile of environmental conditions which can elicit it. However, I think that the gender system, the system that's getting people to act in gendered ways, as I've talked about it before, the gender display system, I suspect it's a totally different system. And it doesn't seem to be like any system I can really capture in my brain, except, hold on, I'm thinking, could it be that it's related to that system where, like, after I watch a Bill and Ted movie, I'll, like, accidentally talk like Bill and Ted sometimes, or after I go to another country and I hear like an accent, people will think I'm accidentally mocking them because you copy the accent sometimes. Could it be related to that system? I don't know. Does anyone here have any insight into what system it might be that non-sexually motivates gender displays? Or am I just unique and that's not a system that a lot of people have?
Of course, people are going to have like natural behaviors based on like hormones, brain structure and everything. That makes them more prone to certain things, certain interests, certain behaviors. You can say, for example, that some people are like more naturally feminine. What's interesting is that sometimes people think that because they are like feminine, they should maybe transition or at least consider it. But then there's this big pushback against that. People say, oh, you shouldn't like transition, you should just be like gender non-conformative. And this is a big debate topic. I think the general consensus is that if you are just gender non-conformative, this will be like a legitimate reason to transition, that you shouldn't do that. You should like just be gender non-conformative and not like conform to gender roles like that. But I'm not sure if this is really the correct way forward, to be honest.
Well, I mean, it's a tough question. I think it's made harder by the way our society almost necessarily has to relate to transness. So I would agree. Like, if I was being like for my kids, like if I was saying, okay, what I'd say, do what works best for you. Choose what your goals are in life, and then those goals will be somewhat modified in how easy they are to achieve by the gender you choose to identify as, given your proclivities. So, for example, if their goal was to, have a lot of kids or something like that, even if it would be, psychologically harder for them, it's likely like overall easier for them not to transition. But if their goal is to like get as much sex as possible or feel as much happiness as possible, well, then the question becomes a lot harder. And it becomes harder still because the communities that are going to push you one way or the other often have a lot of psychological reasons for doing that outside of just providing honest advice. So for some communities, it's like, well, if a person can choose to transition for a reason that's different from the reasons I chose to transition, then that could be invalidating, because then the public would see like, oh, some trans people transition for this reason, so maybe a lot of them do, or maybe I did, So I can see that, but then there's also the other side, which is like, well, I've transitioned and now I sort of need to learn to be really happy about that, because it's detransitioning is like the only thing harder than transitioning. So I sort of have to distort to an extent how I'm perceiving how excited I am about the outcome, which can cause, misreported experiences, which means that if you're an individual that's questioning this, I think it can be really, really hard to feel like you're getting honest answers. And I think the Transmaxxing community is probably the closest people get to honest answers, which is what I like about the community, because it seems to be willing to give answers even when they're not what I think any individual group would like to promote.
I think this might be a difference between me and some other people, because I feel a sense that I have to take care of people here, that I want to protect people, help them make good decisions. And to me this is more important than like helping Joe Biden win re-election or whatever.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that when we talk about the future of trans acceptance, and when I say trans acceptance, for me, radical trans acceptance is not what like the trans rights activists are advocating for. It's just not caring. But that is obviously not what I think the trans rights activists want right now. It's like a different class status. But I think that eventually, if society continues to move in the direction we are now, we will eventually hit a just not caring standpoint. The problem I see when I think about like political politics in transness is that the factions and cultural groups within our society that are pushing that agenda that is moving us in that direction are also the lowest fertility groups, and they can really only survive by deconverting people of more conservative cultural groups that are typically pretty hostile to really any sort of well, it's actually interesting. So typically within a lot of cultures, the most conservative position on same-sex attractiveness is forced gender transition. So trans individuals are seen in a lot of super conservative cultural groups. They're just not seen in like middling conservative cultural groups. But those groups seem to have the highest fertility rates, these middling conservative cultural groups.
There are plenty of moderately conservative areas which have a very poor fertility rate. For example, Hungary and Poland. So it's not clear that embracing conservative policies will actually do anything to raise the birth rate. And if you actually do want to raise the birth rate, there are far more effective ways to do so than to attack trans rights.
eventually they'll either die out or they'll get better at preventing deconversion, which means that overall, like if we're talking a 200-year time span, society is going to become increasingly hostile to gender nonconforming individuals, even if within the lifetime of the members of this group, I think it will become more accepting, which is pretty interesting from a strategic perspective. I actually think that the biggest thing an individual could do for long-term pushing the needle in that direction in the maximum number of cultural groups would be to increase access to technology that makes full transition easier and lower cost. So, well, not even full transition, but variable transition, like makes it easier to, grow breasts if you wanted to grow breasts, and then ungrow breasts if you wanted to ungrow breasts. And when we look at the sorts of genetic technology that my wife and I are controversially known for engaging with, I could say with a high degree of certainty that within 200 years, we will have technology that would allow potentially genetic gender transition, which would be very interesting.
Yeah, regarding breast growth, for example, you actually already have the genetics for it. You just need the hormones technically. So it's actually fairly easy that part. I think the issue is that estrogen is actually too powerful, so it changes too much, maybe more than you want. So for example, you might not actually want to lose your fertility, like even temporarily isn't really ideal.
Yeah.
So right now, if you want to reproduce as a trans female, you have to either get off HRT for 3 months, or you have to use sperm that you banked, and neither is particularly convenient.
Yeah, no, it's really tough. Well, and very expensive. I mean, obviously there's various ways it can be done, and it's tough. I'll go through other interesting thoughts I had from the research that you sent me. One of the most interesting statistics that I noticed is that if you're talking about cis women, it showed that 90% of them would be considered autogynephilic in at least one of the peer-reviewed papers that you sent me. And I found that really surprising, because if that's true, and I didn't misread something, or it's not just a real outlier of a result.
Yeah, it is an outlier in the sense that it showed 93%, but it was using the same criteria as a discredited sexologist. So when they used the more stricter criteria, they only got 28%, because they used the pseudoscientific measuring method that they got the 93%. So it's not really representative. Typically you get lower than that when you use stricter criteria. But go ahead.
But if it's anywhere close to those numbers, what it would mean is that your average cis woman is what we would consider autogynephilic. And when you consider how much people's sexuality changes when they go through transition, it would only make sense that they would fall into that sexuality category after a transition, if that's the normal cis female's gender relation. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, but what we do see is that it's actually stronger prior to HRT. So because of the stronger sex drive, the autogynephilia is displayed more. So maybe this is why some people feel like they have a fetish they need to repress, because they have those not really the same as cis females. So but then when they transition, they become more like a normal female in terms of their sexuality. They don't really get so extreme. So this is also why it's maybe hard to repress when you have strong autogynephilia, because you're on male hormones, it becomes more intense, so you have no real avenue to display it.
Well, to the other statistic that I found really interesting when I was going over the studies, and this statistic I liked so much I screenshot it and sent it to my wife, because I was like, this one sort of confirms some of our theories, but it could also just be completely out there, which it showed that trans individuals, after they transition, trans females specifically, after they transition, care more about what their partner looks like than cis females. And why I found this interesting is one of the things that we noted is that this is just reflecting on my own and my wife's gender relation. We have very, very, very low, I just do not care really what gender I display as, and she doesn't feel that really strong either. So it's harder for us to judge what this feeling is. And we were then thinking, what if one of the things that is unusual about trans individuals is not just that they would prefer to identify as the opposite gender, but that they care about gender strongly at all, and that seemed to show that they care about the gender, like the physical gender of their partner, the way it displays, more than your average woman would. I don't know, I thought that was interesting, but I could be wrong. It was just something we were pulling at.
I mean, it makes sense that people who transition are the ones who feel like strongest about gender, because there are actually a lot of people in between who don't really care either way. And the thing is that people who are like strongly in one direction of the project, I think that everyone else is like that. So for example, you see some of the trans activists say that, oh, if you like got breast as a cis man, you would like super dislike that, but this is not really how it works for a lot of people, because a lot of people don't really care.
Yeah.
But obviously there are people who strongly care, like they are born male or really want to be male or really want to display that. You see that as well. And this is like more normalized and accepted, but if you are like born male and want to display like as a female, then you might have more like problems or whatever, or at least things you have to do about it.
So here's a question I have. One of the things when I look at accounts of people who are transitioning, we have talked a few times about how when individuals transition, their sexuality often changes in various ways to match, in some ways, more the gender that they're transitioning into. And that when you have people transition to females, common to go from like, a 1 on the Kinsey scale to like a middling point on the Kinsey scale, to not being aroused at all by men, or not being aroused at all by women, to, in common society, would be called bisexual. However, there's a core difference in male and female when you have cis males who are gay versus cis females who are gay. Something that we note is very odd is that when cis males are gay, they often have sort of a disgust reaction to women, like naked women. And when cis men are straight, they often have something of a disgust reaction to naked men. They are usually pretty far at one end or the other on the Kinsey scale, whereas cis women and gay women are often closer to the center of the Kinsey scale. I was wondering, when people transition to become men, do they also have this phenomenon that's opposite of when people transition to become women, where they move to extreme ends of the Kinsey scale?
What I can answer is in the other direction. I've seen a lot of people talk about how they are like attracted to men as well, or they want to like experiment maybe. This seems to be fairly common that trans females want to feel like how it is to have sex as a woman. They at least want to like feel like how older women feel. It might be more of a curiosity thing for some people. Some people like keep doing stuff like that, so they actually enjoy it. And then they might go to a female next time. So it seems like when people transition, they might become more pansexual when they transition from male to female. Maybe Val can talk about it. I think she has some experience with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, for me, a lot of it was repression, and like I used to think I was attracted to women, but I don't think that was ever the case. But since going on estrogen, I feel like there's been like more openness to it, at least, where there isn't like as much of a repulsion.
That's interesting. One of our key theories that is weirdly, like, I don't know why it's not more obvious to people, is that the sexuality system, when we're describing our sexual profiles, we probably shouldn't describe them just by the things that arouse us, but also the things that are repellent to us. Likely, like, the disgust and arousal systems are probably using a lot of the same brain architecture, and that it's likely you're not on a scale from, like, 1 to 0 on things, but you're likely on a scale from, like, 1 to -1 on things, and that seems to be, like, sexualities from 0 and below, like, disgust reaction to things, seem to be much stronger in men than in women.
But here is something really interesting. And I still cannot really explain this in words too well, but there are some people who it seems like they kind of enjoy the humiliation aspect or whatever of like being like sexually dominated by males. This kind of turns them on is sometimes called like masochistic animalization fetish. And I see that a lot in trans females, that they kind of get turned on by being like dominated and sort of humiliated and things like that. So it's almost like the disgusting one was turns them on, and maybe this is something like that. So maybe the disgust isn't necessarily always a negative. It can make it like maybe turn the people on as well.
I do kind of have to agree with Malcolm in some sense that there are turn-ons and turn-offs, and it doesn't have to be like in relation to how disgusting it is normally. Shit. Okay, so there's a Q&A. There's
Oh,
a
let's do a
question
Q&A.
from-
Yeah, sorry.
Yes, there is a question in chat. I'll say it. Here you
Oh
go.
yeah, please.
What do you think makes a male or a female, and at what point does a male become a female? Does referring to biological males as women and using preferred pronouns obscure the meaning of woman?
I don't think it. So there's sort of two questions here. I think different cultures can relate to this question differently, and I think that the question is entirely within a cultural group's framework. So I could say from a conservative Christian perspective, what's the answer to this? From a conservative Muslim perspective, what's the answer to this? And those would be one or two answers. If you say, okay, yes, but like absolutely in the most like secular, truest version, what's the answer to this question? And the answer is male and female are sort of meaningless terms when you atomize it like that, because then you're sort of saying, okay, well, you could define male and female as, is it an XY chromosome or an XX chromosome? But that doesn't always work. Or would the average person say that this was a male or a female? Or do they feel like a male or a female? Or do they, and there's a billion different definitions you could use for what means male and female. And then a person could say, well, what's the right one? And I would say, yeah, but if you're answering secularly, like from a culturally independent perspective, the question of what is the right one is just a pointless question, because that's saying which of these perspectives on male and female matters more than the other perspectives. And I would say that that question is a cultural question. Different cultures can decide to elevate different interpretations. In an absolute like scientific, completely secular context, it doesn't matter. Then the question could be like, okay, well, let's frame this question a bit differently. Which cultures are going to outcompete other cultures? You could say that the cultures that are more competitive, their definition of male and female is the correct definition, because it's, I don't know, might makes right. Well, those cultures are typically going to be higher fertility rate cultures, so they're typically going to have cultures with more traditionalist views, because that just leads to more people being born. You could instead argue, okay, no, the correct culture is the culture that makes people the happiest. Well, this gets really interesting. I think progressive culture would say, well, then the correct answer is...
Male fertility isn't even the limiting factor when it comes to birth rate in the first place. The actual limiting factors are resources, people actually being willing to have children in the first place, and people being able to get pregnant, and having people transition from male to female might not actually diminish any of that. It can instead allow people to live a happier life, be more productive, and then contribute more to society, allowing for a greater total fertility rate. And there are ways to have children after transitioning, even if they are a bit inconvenient.
Whichever way a person wants to be identified is the correct way to do this. However, I don't know if long-term that necessarily makes people happiest. I think that we can see that certain types of cultural restrictions seem to increase happiness in the long term, like fasting would be an example of this. Now, whether this is an area where those cultural restrictions matter, I wouldn't have data one way or the other, so I just don't know. But I wouldn't say it's obvious to me that long term, that might be an unsatisfying answer to that question, but I think it's the truest answer I can give from my perspective. Oh, the final answer could be, how would I raise my kids? Because then you're saying, okay, yeah, but from your cultural perspective, the culture that you're building for your kids. And I guess I would say, as my wife and I have talked about internally, we would just, I think emphasize the costs of transitioning more than I think default society does right now, because I genuinely think that default society sort of undersells some of the costs of transitioning. I would not say that it is the wrong solution if you just feel like it's something you need to do to achieve whatever your goals are in life. And to that end, then male and female is defined by whether or not you want to go through the work of identifying as a different gender to your birth gender. And then of course this becomes a more nuanced question if somebody's born like intersex, and at that point it's just like, well, I guess in this case just whatever you want to identify as, because there's some social cost either way. I don't know if that was satisfying or not as an answer.
I mean, it makes sense at least that for one, the progressives and left have the issue that they prioritize short-term results. They want people to be happy for the moment, to just be nice to everyone. And they don't think like 100 years, 200 years in the future what the consequences will be for certain actions. So they actually pursue policies that can defeat their own ideology because they don't think long-term, they think just short-term. And you can like easily solve the issue with like low birth rate, with like eugenics, if you just abandon liberalism. It's very easy to solve, but people don't want to implement in popular policies. And it's kind of the same with gender norms, is that you want to include more people to like make people happy, but then you devalue the concept themselves, because then you devalue the concept female, so it becomes less meaningful. While if you have a more meaningful standard, and you actually do have a bimodal distribution for male and female, you can of course debate the exact nature of it, but in most cases it's fairly obvious. Like even with intersex people, it's actually obvious in most cases that they are either like on the female side or on the male side.
Yeah. Well, and another problem is just getting data for this, because so if you look at studies, because I mean the question is then, if I take the position of progressive society, but I ask the questions that progressive society doesn't want to ask, is on average, does somebody who think they want to transition, are they happier after transitioning because they transitioned?
We already do have fairly decent data showing that transition is indeed beneficial because of HRT specifically, because we have multivariate regression studies. We can isolate multiple variables and see what actually helps, and what we do see is that hormone replacement therapy and social support are both beneficial and statistically significantly so.
And the place that gets tricky is if you look at studies that measured this, typically the older the study is, the more it will say, actually it doesn't seem to make them that much happier. And then the newer studies, but you'd be fired if you said otherwise in a newer study.
I don't agree with the interpretation of the data, because I looked at all the studies. Yeah. That, for example, they had like one interpretation by the doctor, by the clinician, and another interpretation by the patient, and the patient did report like better than the clinician, but the clinician did find that most people benefited from it. So like when I look at all the studies, like I don't see anyone showing like transition to be detrimental. I actually think the worst result was actually from a newer study that looked at children. So I think maybe you should pick some studies. I didn't read all of them, but we can maybe like discuss it at a later time. I can like send you the data if you want to.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that seems like fairly what I guess I saw as well, if I understood you correctly. I mean, obviously things really change as society becomes more accepting, and so of course you would almost certainly see people as happier.
Yeah, but we don't really see people doing necessarily better in terms of like self-reported, like when it comes to self-reported data, it hasn't really improved. What has improved is the suicide mortality. It has actually gone down for the transgender population, and this is an objective measure because it's measured people who die. You cannot really fake that.
Yeah. Well, okay, do we have any other questions in the Q&A that I can get to?
Here we go. We got one from Literal Stacy. Can transsexuality be used as a proxy to mitigate negative effects of polygamy, which would increase fertility on a macro scale?
Yes, and it's done in cultures. So typically, when you have polygynous cultures, the cultures that so one thing we talk about in our show is that different cultures relate to same-sex attracted individuals in different ways. Like progressive culture, I think just sort of sees all conservative cultures as being like the evangelicals, which is just like suppress it. But you know, in traditional Muslim societies where you do have polygyny, one man, many women, well, of course, that's going to lead to some men being unattracted, unattached. And it is in those societies where the quote unquote correct solution for same sex attraction is much more likely to be forced transition, and where otherwise transgender individuals are treated as very like when I say non-special, it's more just like, yeah, this is something that the conservative iterations of our cultural group accept.
There are only two Islamic countries with currently all of transsexuality are Egypt and Iran. Egypt has a polygyny rate of less than 1%. Iran has a total of 0.5%. The reason for both of those countries accepting transsexuality is caused by the fatwa of Imam Khomeini in Iran and fatwa by Al-Ashar, the leading body of religious judicial rulings in Egypt. However, regardless of polygamy rates in other Middle Eastern countries such as Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Yemen and Oman, no legal or religious support exists for transsexuality in those other countries. Notably, polygamy rates are lower in the Middle East than in West Africa, where polygamy is still common. And within West Africa, transsexuality has no explicit legal protections in any of the countries where polygamy is still common. Chad, Nigeria, Senegal, Mali. Well, it might possibly be true that in native culture there may be a correlation between third genders and polygamy. No known research exists which aggregates this data. Thus, there is at worst a negative correlation between support for polygamy and a best neutral correlation based on currently available data.
And as such, an individual could argue that the reason why we see, culturally within a society as it becomes polygamous, more accepting of trans individuals, in sort of the progressive world, like, could that be one of the motivators for this? It could be one of the motivators because it is something we see across polygynous societies. It clearly works.
As a form of social control that you're going to either push people towards transition or even force them, because then you can satisfy each other males at least to make them content and not rebel against you. So in terms of social control, it's very interesting. I don't think it will be done in Western societies first. It will maybe be done in some like totalitarian or authoritarian countries like China might do something like that. But I don't see America doing it anytime soon.
Yeah, China's not going to do it anytime soon, but it's an interesting cultural strategy which has been intergenerationally successful within some cultural groups. And so it is both potentially like, it has some ethical problems in that, they would force people who aren't trans but are same-sex attracted to transition. So I can't say it's the ethical solution, but it is a intergenerationally stable solution.
Like what I was talking about earlier, when you have like more widespread polygamy, it's not enough to like force the homosexual to trans. You have to do it wider for that to be like really effective. So this might actually be detrimental because people might dislike being forced to transition more than they dislike not having a partner, so it might not actually work too well.
Yeah. But no, it's a good question, and I would note statistics. This assumes that I think the listener knows is that if you look at societies that are polygynous, typically the more unattached cis males there are in that society, the higher the chance of revolution and the higher the chance of social unrest. So there is a reason to get rid of these individuals. I mean, obviously, another way to do it is just kill them in wars or something.
Yeah, you can send them to other places, and like often I think when the country has polygyny at a wider scale is that they have to constantly attack other countries and invade them. And eventually, like even if that works, they're going to run out because they conquered the entire planet. So eventually you probably have to abolish it or restrict it more. So you have to maybe restrict polygamy to the like high politician, something like that. How the leaders of the country might have more than one wife, but it's not really the norm for the population. Because there isn't really very left to conquer, or there are countries you want to conquer but you can't because you don't have the means. It's too risky at the moment, so then you have to like scale it back again.
Well, that's exciting. I've really enjoyed chatting with you guys. I hope this was fun. I don't know. It's always fun to talk with groups who see things differently. And Based Camp is our podcast, which is on YouTube and all the other stuff. And The Pragmatist Guide to Sexuality might also be interesting to people here, but it's a much drier book. It's much more closer to like Ayla's statistic studies and stuff like that. But yeah, I really appreciate you guys chatting with me.
Yeah, have a nice day.
You too.
Make sure to like and subscribe.
And this marks the end of episode 17 of the Transmaxxing podcast. Have a nice day, everyone.